Hey, it's Minute Book Reports, and I just want to talk about 8 keys to writing and how to get better on writing. These aren't my rules, but these are by an author named Kurt Vonnegut. I haven't done any of his books on my Minute Book Reports channel yet, but when I came across sort of his rules, I thought they were really great, and so I just wanted to share some of my thoughts on his 8 rules. Rule number 1 is find a subject that you care about. I think this is very important, especially if you don't know what you want to write about. I think writing, like a lot of other activities, is best done well when it's motivated by the right things. And so writing what you care about will just make writing more interesting and more fun. And what we care about is usually what we talk about the most or what we think about the most. So for me, I enjoy writing, reading, and like politics maybe, and so those might be the things that I turn to when I need to write about things. Then it's sort of a matter of just transferring my thoughts and my feelings about those issues and sort of turning it into a paper. Number 2 is don't ramble, and this is tough for me because as a talker I sometimes tend to ramble, but this is very important when it comes to writing. When we talk, I think it's okay to ramble a little bit because when our listener is listening to us, they can just sort of like turn away and look at other things as we're talking, and then when there's something interesting that we're saying, they can always like revert their attention back to what we're actually saying. But when you write, you don't have the luxury of that option because writing or reading in itself takes so much focus. If the author who's writing the words is rambling, the reader has nowhere to turn to, and they're gonna sense that, yeah, this isn't really that important, and they're probably gonna look and be distracted somewhere else. Number 3 is keep it simple, and I try to tell my students that when outlining sort of like an essay for them, and so I try to make it as simple as possible. And so I recommend an introduction with a strong thesis statement, and then first point, second point, third point, counter argument paragraph, and then a strong conclusion, sort of with a wrap up, but also a restatement of the thesis just in case the reader has forgotten. And that's not to say that you can't do variations of that, or that you have to be uncreative, or that everything has to look all the same in every essay. But I think keeping it simple means it's organized, and it helps the reader in kind of knowing what to expect. You know, it's sort of like a lot of movies or a lot of just general stories where we have the hero and then we meet sort of like the villain, and then there's the conflict, and then it sort of has these like challenges, and they're kind of expected, but it's still interesting. Stories get kind of weird when you kind of move things around. Things become hard for normal people to sort of understand. Again, that's not to say that it always has to be that way, but I think it's important to sort of at least have that foundation of keeping it simple and organized, and then from that point on you can sort of build on that and change things and sort of use like non-conventional devices. Number 4 is have the guts to cut, and this is tough because I think as writers we tend to put a lot of ourselves into our writing, or it's very personal. You know, when you have to start cutting things, maybe it's sort of like a tearing of yourself a little bit. But I think that the ability to edit or polish or to cut, I think it stems from self-discipline and like a little bit of like humility to not think that whatever we write is perfect the first time. For me, that's usually never the case where whatever I wrote the first time is the best. I'm usually writing 4 or 5 drafts. I mean, there's some minor changes here and there with, you know, some time sort of set in between when I do the draft or when I sort of revisit what I wrote, but it's still important. And sometimes I may think that it's amazing the first time, but I've written enough where I know, yeah, the first time is usually pretty rough. I think for a lot of us, when we are sort of taught to write, it's all about just word counts, right, or page counts, and so we just want to write in quantity, but it's not just about the quantity, it's also about the quality of that. And so I think that's why in sort of learning how to cut and not being afraid to cut, it sort of brings back, and it almost feels counterintuitive. But as an effective communicator, I think it's important not just to know what to say, but also it's important to know what not to say. And part of knowing what not to say is being able to edit and cut the words that we have put out, at least when we start writing. Number 5 is sound like yourself. And I don't know why people try to sound like other people. It's kind of weird to me. Like, I'll have some people like they'll write and then they like use like a fancy like vocabulary word that I've never heard them use before, or you know, I can just tell that they just right clicked on the word and then they just looked at like synonyms or like a thesaurus, and it's great to try to use those words, but when you're writing, especially for something that's not maybe as academic, I think it's okay to just sound like yourself. I think it's okay to use the words that you would normally use and just be sort of happy happy with that. Now, if you want to use those fancy words, then that's good. I mean, but try to incorporate that when you actually speak. So if you're gonna say something like loquacious, try to use that in a real sentence as you're talking and conversing with like normal people. But to use loquacious in an essay where you've never used that word before, it just seems so out of place, especially when the rest of the words in that sentence don't really match up to that level. And I get it. I think people try to make themselves sound smarter than they are, and again, that's okay. But from the reader's perspective, it kind of demonstrates sort of a lack of self-confidence, like low self-esteem in the person if they're trying to sort of overcompensate by using big words or by just not sounding like themselves. I think writing is a lot about expressing who you are as the person, as the author, as the writer to the reader. And so if you're trying to pretend to be someone else, unless you're an actor or something, like, but if you're trying to be someone else, then the paper just doesn't sound genuine, and you sort of like lose, I think, a major element when it comes to writing. Number 6 is say what you mean to say. And this doesn't just apply to writing, this also applies to speaking. I think we have a hard time saying what we want or saying what we mean, because people will oftentimes sort of allude to certain things, or maybe they expect people to know certain things, but it's not always the case, and there's sort of like miscommunication, and it happens quite a bit. But in writing, at least you get the chance and opportunity to be very clear by rereading what you're communicating, and that way making it and clarifying anything that you have to say. So for me, what this means is being very straightforward with what you're communicating. So if you're trying to say that this is a certain reason because of this, or you think this is important because of this, then you should just say that. Don't try to allude to certain things or be fancy about it. Just state that, and then after you state that, I think it's okay to go back and see if you need to sort of add more support, like research or analogies, or maybe some stories or something like that. But that always comes after the fact that you stated like your main reason. Number 7 is pity the reader, and I never thought about this until I became a reader in the sense of a grader. And so before, I would just, type out stuff, write things down, and submit it, and just be like, oh, whatever, it's not my problem, right? But as I'm having to grade essays and hundreds of papers I've graded already, and it's just like, okay, yeah, please try to think about me, but not just me, but think about your audience as you're writing. It's sort of like marketing. You try to tailor what you're producing and presenting to who you're going to present it to. Like, as a reader and a grader, I'm trying to read for enjoyment, but if I have to stop every paragraph or every sentence to correct the same mistake for like the 3rd or 4th time, it sort of becomes not as enjoyable. It's like, I just want clear ideas. I want someone to guide me through this conversation, through the essay that we're having. I don't want to have to figure it out by myself. So because there's so many things sort of vying for my attention, and it's very easy to get distracted, if I have to stop to like think about what I'm reading, or I have to like struggle to get through it, then usually my attention will turn to something else, which is never a good thing. And that's not my intention, but that's just sort of what naturally happens. So always try to keep your audience or your reader in mind. And number 8 is to look at detailed advice in the Elements of Style. Elements of Style was actually the first book about writing that I ever bought. It was one of those required readings for my class in college, and as I sort of like looked through it, it really wasn't that exciting. It looked like a grammar book with a lot of like very technical things about writing, not very fun, but it's actually very important. I don't really know what's being taught in schools in terms of grammar. I'm glad that I had at least a pretty strong foundation when it came to spelling and punctuation and things like that, sentence structure, because that helps me now, where I don't have to rely so much on spell check, I don't have to rely on autocorrect, and even those things aren't always correct. Another book that I'd recommend is On Writing by Stephen King. It's a little bit lighter than The Elements of Style, but I actually purchased it after I graduated from college. Again, I think both books are great, especially if you want to really improve your writing without, having to like write all the time. Those 2 books, I think, present some pretty valuable lessons and very practical ideas, and so I definitely recommend both of them. So those are the 8 rules to better writing from Kurt Vonnegut. I kind of wish I had known about this when I was in school, because it might have helped me to write. I know I did a lot of writing in college and later on, but it would have definitely helped me. Particularly the cutting part would have helped me, how to learn how to cut and be okay with that, since I do tend to write longer than sort of the required word count or page count. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you later.